Nick Spencer's new run on Spider-Man has finally reached 10 issues plus an annual, which is actually the second annual this year because Marvel thinks we have no attention span. Regardless, I think it's a good amount of time to really get a feel for how he handles the character and what he'll do with it in the future. I think it's important to get past the initial story arc to really know what a run will be like. For example, Chip Zdarsky's run on Spectacular Spider-Man was pretty boring for the first few issues, and felt like a superhero Seinfeld with no stakes. But then he found his footing and kicked it into high gear with arguably one of the best Spider-Man runs the past 20 years. Nick Spencer's already wrapping up a third storyline, and I finally collected enough of my thoughts to talk about it. Primarily that I have a crazy conspiracy theory about it. I think this book is written almost entirely from an angle of criticizing modern Spider-Man comics that came before it. While I was initially a little worried about him getting handed the title after the Hydra Cap fiasco last year, I think Nick has come around to making something really great. This book feels like Spider-Man again, because he understands the character a little better than Dan Slott did. You know, the guy who wrote the book for the past 10 years. And like I said, I think the most interesting part about this book happens to be the not-so-subtle differences between Spencer's Peter Parker and Slott's Peter Parker, which is kind of what the whole first arc is about. Despite the two of them aligning pretty much the same politically and being friends behind the scenes, I can't help but notice how much of the subtext of this book seems to be taking potshots at Slott's writing over the years. Nick Spencer's Amazing Spider-Man book deconstructs and heavily criticizes Dan Slott's Amazing Spider-Man book. And given Slott's less than stellar relationship with the fans, that does a lot to get longtime Spidey readers back into the book. It's essentially saying that the weird direction the book has been going for 10 years is over, and that Spencer is going to bring back a more traditional version of Peter Parker that's closer to what we had before... Ugh. But in order for my analysis of Spencer's book to make sense, I better give some context regarding why the book is so out of line with Slott's vision. Dan Slott isn't an inherently bad writer. In fact, I've loved a couple of his stories. But he's made a lot of decisions to deliberately piss off fans of the book because he has this mantra.
It's good to show contempt for your audience. Just ask Michael Bay.
He was never afraid to challenge the status quo of Spider-Man or try new things. But the irritation with Spidey fans came from his decisions usually having no lasting effect or trampling on established and consistent ideas to fit his own. Here's a few examples. He does something like Superior Spider-Man, which gives a long redemption arc for Doc Ock. Then he dies heroically to bring Peter back. Good stuff. And then shortly after that brings him back again as a villain. And then he has to start the redemption arc over again? He introduces a new love interest for Peter in Carly Cooper, but she gets passed around between so many writers that her personality is never fully established and readers just can't get interested in her. Then when he takes over as the full-time writer of the book and has the opportunity to correct that, he pretty much just gets rid of her as a love interest and forgets she exists. He also completely rewires Black Cat's character and turns her into a heartless, murdering villain, even though it's extremely out of her character. And then the big one. Parker Industries is an interesting idea, but it goes against a lot of core character traits of Spider-Man and makes him unrelatable for about 30 issues, and then he just writes it all away like it never happened. Hell, in One More Day, Parker Industries is cited as a proverbial bad end for Peter's life where he just becomes lonely and self-destructive. I think this leads into the biggest point of contention between Slott and fans about Peter's characterization. Dan Slott hates Peter Parker. He thinks Peter Parker is his own worst enemy and incredibly self-destructive and toxic to the people around him. That's not Spider-Man. Sure, that could maybe fit Daredevil, and it especially works for Iron Man. But never Spidey. Peter Parker is a victim of fate the majority of the time. He was relatable because his problems were usually out of his control, and he felt like the world was shitting on him all the time because he made one mistake. It wasn't just a constant stream of selfish actions compounding on each other and damaging his relationships. Slott pretty much writes Peter Parker to piss off and alienate everyone around him, and constantly end up being a loser because he was incompetent and selfish. He makes Peter Parker a jerk with no regard for others. He makes Peter Parker irresponsible. Let's run it down. Peter takes credit for all of the accomplishments Ock made in his body and capitalizes on it to start his own company and make money. Peter buys the Baxter Building, and when Johnny is angry about it, he chooses to fight him and endanger people instead of just explaining himself because Slott wanted an action scene in the issue. Peter gets jealous of Iron Man and tries to beat the shit out of him in a public place. Peter lets Harry handle all of the fallout of the company tanking and bails on him because he doesn't feel like helping and then justifies it to himself. Peter continuously tries to murder the Venom symbiote after knowing full well that it's a living and sentient creature. Peter fights Johnny Storm again and then lets the supervillain escape because he was nice enough to help keep the building from tumbling after their fight, even though letting criminals get away leads to very bad things. Making Peter an inconsiderate asshole is where Dan Slott's Spider-Man fails and why it ends up pushing so many fans away. That's not relatable and that's not a role model. Sure, he was never perfect and he made some pretty big mistakes before, but Peter Parker was never an inherently selfish guy. Nor did he choose to act solely for his benefit at the cost of others. And after 10 long years of frustration from Dan and his readers, he finally leaves the book with a lackluster character death and a generic one-shot issue we've seen a million times before. This sets the stage for Nick Spencer to come back in and pick up the pieces. And he starts right away with a choice that caught my eye. Bringing back Randy Robertson as Peter's roommate and friend. Not a lot of people remember it, but there was a time in the 90s where MJ was kidnapped by a supervillain who faked her death. Peter was all distraught and lonely with nowhere to live, so Randy took him in as his roommate and became his best friend, since Harry was dead at this point. Randy and Peter shared financial struggles with a smile and went out on the town to party and cheer up Peter about MJ's quote-unquote death. Then after MJ came back, Randy kind of faded back into obscurity in the books and had only random guest appearances now and then. I really liked their interaction back in those days, and I was sad to see that dissolve so quickly. It's cool to see Spencer bring that back, and it also serves as a sort of rejection of something Slott did a few years prior in Big Time Spider-Man. I think this has to be the most clear-cut example of the way Slott wrote his stories for Spider-Man. I present to you the Kevin the Moldy Piece of Cheese paradox. During the very beginning of the Big Time arc, Peter ends up evicted for the billionth time and needs another roommate. So his first resort is to call Randy. Randy then gives him the cold shoulder and acts like he's a huge prick and he can't stand him. Slott even goes so far as to write in a super deep-cut reference to some random joke from like 17 years earlier in the book where Peter keeps an old piece of cheese in the fridge and names it Kevin. Back then, Randy just kind of jokingly blew it off and started asking Peter if he would come hang out for that night. He felt like Peter was becoming too closed off and he needed to get out more. He was genuinely worried about his mental well-being, but in Slott's book, Randy tells him to go fuck himself and hangs up. Why? Because then it would impede on the direction of the book that Slott wanted to go. So that means he has a strong familiarity of this story and these characters to make references like this. And he knew Randy would be the most logical option, but he changed the character's personality to allow for the story he wanted to tell. He changes the characters to fit the story instead of the other way around. It's something so minor, but I think this is fundamentally the most straightforward case of why Slott's writing is so subject to criticism. He knows how things should be, but he doesn't care, and he changes it anyway because he thinks his idea is better than the sensible thing. So he writes all kinds of character interactions that don't feel true to these characters. And then we get this preview issue from Spencer where Randy is back to being Peter's friend. But then Peter lets a criminal get away for a really flimsy justification. And as a reader, I was immediately worrying that we'd be back to the same old shit of him doing the wrong thing constantly. But then in issue 1, Peter acknowledges that it was out of character to do that, and he feels bad about it. Then shortly after, it's revealed to the world that Peter got all of his degrees in science by plagiarizing the work of Otto Octavius, kind of. This means that Peter loses his job and is punished for being irresponsible. And then Spencer does something kind of interesting. He starts finally pointing out how weird and out of character Peter has been for the past few years. He goes so far as to compare actions like taking credit for Otto's work to letting Uncle Ben's killer escape. That's extreme, but, I understand the sentiment. Now, I know the obvious example of Spencer's Spider-Man being a return to form is him getting back together with MJ, which feels really long overdue. But again, he frames the scene of them getting back together almost identical to something Slott did a few months prior, but has a totally different outcome. This all builds up to the focal point of the first arc, Spider-Man and Peter Parker becoming two different people. During a random sci-fi accident, Peter and Spidey become split into two different guys, divvying up their personality traits equally among the two of them. One could assume at the start of this that Spencer is going for a brains versus brawn sort of thing, like how Clark Kent had to outsmart Superman in that one movie. But then we're given a curveball and learning that the Spidey half is still a science whiz and now Peter's intelligence is that of an average 30-something jobless burnout. That's when I figured Spencer was going for something a little unconventional. He split Peter Parker into two halves. The character we all know and love who just wants to be responsible, and a not-so-exaggerated caricature of modern Spider-Man. I was racking my brain over it for days, but I figured it out. This is that obnoxious, selfish douchebag that we've been reading for the past 10 years. It all checks out. So this version of Spidey is devoid of responsibility, but he's not an idiot. He's opportunistic and uses his intelligence to take selfish things. He steals himself a super robot to trash the city and stop crime in half the time. He also tries to bank on his own superpowers by selling himself as an Uber service. His sense of humor goes way overboard from quips into just being half-baked and ill-placed references. And he does whatever he can to screw over Peter Parker and ignore his existence. A major plot point of Slott's final arc on the book was that he was spending more time as Spider-Man than as Peter Parker, because he had done so much to wreck Peter Parker's life and it was easier to just ignore all the consequences. This is echoed in how Slott Spidey doesn't pay Peter any attention and dismisses him as a boring loser. Spencer takes every negative and annoying trope from the other run and turns it into a character that fully expresses what was so wrong with the book for 10 years. In fact, he turns this take on Spidey into an antagonist for Peter. Peter doesn't beat him by just being smarter. In fact, he takes advantages of Slott Spidey's negligence and defeats him in a really simple way that even an idiot could have pulled off. Peter ultimately triumphs because responsibility is the most powerful trait between the two of them. Even though the other guy has the brains, the jokes, and all the powers, he wasn't really Spider-Man. Because Spider-Man is about doing the right thing, even when it puts you in a world of hurt. Not doing the wrong thing to avoid being hurt. Now, feel free to call me a loony and say I'm cloud-watching to create a subtext that isn't there. Maybe my negative feelings toward the previous writing in the book has made me biased, and I want to interpret miscellaneous things as jabs. But I think you have to admit that maybe my theory holds some weight in a few places. Beyond all this possible criticism of his predecessor, I think Spencer just nails a lot of the smaller nuances of the character. His Peter Parker has a better sense of humor that's less reliant on instantly dated pop culture references. He's also better at making Spidey feel like an underdog, who wins by outsmarting the bad guy rather than outsmashing him. I also really enjoy the way he tied this book into his first Spidey-related endeavor. Superior Foes of Spider-Man is a really quirky and fun series that lets you get to know some of Spidey's low-level baddies a little better, and shows they're a lot like him in a way. Just lovable losers with powers trying to get by. So the decision to have Boomerang become Spidey's friend and start learning some responsibility from him is really cool, actually. Hopefully they bury the hatchet about that whole stop hitting yourself thing he did a few years back. The most recent arc also has Black Cat's character restored to pretty much where she was prior to One More Day. Peter's friend and superhero confidant, who keeps his secret and teams up with him when he needs the backup the most. These last few years, a lot of other writers have been using her as a murderous crime boss who wants to kill Spider-Man, and needless to say, it was pretty out of character. In all three of his story arcs so far, Spencer has given fans something to get excited about. Letting two people just love each other again, a brief reunion of a short-lived and much-loved team, and a long-lasting friendship restored. I'm definitely interested to see what he does with this new villain he's working on. And there's a lot of speculation that he's even planning to fully undo One More Day, which we've been getting a decent number of hints at recently from other creators, but nothing concrete. God, they just keep throwing it in our face, don't they? Speaking of throwing things in your face, hey, did you know that I have a Discord? I have to give props to the art on the new run. Ryan Ottley is a great choice, and I really love the way he frames action scenes. I'm a sucker for the blocky, sharp-edged art style he does because it reminds me of guys like Bruce Timm, John Romita Jr., and Mike Mignola. If I had any complaints, it's that he draws Peter and MJ really similar to Mark and Eve from his other noteworthy book. Roberto Ramos isn't my favorite artist. I really like how the book looked in the Thieves Guild arc. It feels like he's really trying to tighten up his anatomy and perspectives, and I think it's some of his best work. Nick Spencer's book is succeeding in winning over fans right now, after they felt alienated and left to the wayside for about a decade. And it's not because he's just pandering and throwing in fan service. If that was his goal, his stories would have a lot more of this stuff. No, the reason fans are finally backing this book with a smile again is because he's writing something that feels true to the characters. Peter Parker is finally acting like himself again. Like an imperfect guy who still tries his best and puts others before himself. That's the guy that's always been my role model. Feels like the triumphant return of someone we lost a long time ago. And while we've gotten used to a pale imitation, nothing beats the original. Nick Spencer gave us our hero back, and I can't thank him enough. Happy holidays, Miss, and a Merry Kwanzaa. Limited run Christmas merch is now available in the store with designs by my good buddy Joey. The holiday-themed designs are still in stock and they'll be gone about midway through January, so pick them up before they disappear until next year. Please consider buying some of the merch, it really helps me out. The link is in the description.